snow levels. Like the snow itself is several feet deep in the northern part of the watershed, and but it's the water content that concerns us. So we've got places where the water content is 2 to 3 times what you would normally see at this time of the year.
And that's a problem.
That's a problem, because if that all melts rapidly, if you get a real swing to warm weather, if you get some, an inch or two of rain on top of it, that's a lot of water running into the river. And the river has a lot of ice in it now too. So that compounds the problem. So you got a lot of water, a lot of ice flowing downstream. So you're setting yourself up for some pretty serious problems.
And talk a little bit about the conditions that you need to have for a safer spring. As this winter stretches and stretches, the risk grows. Is that true?
Exactly. What we'd like to see is what we call maple syrup weather. So warm days where you have temperatures single digits, and then at night it cools down below freezing. So that allows the snow to melt gradually, the ice to melt gradually, so you don't get this sudden rush of water into the system. The worst case scenario is where you get a big swing in temperature. So you get into the teens and you get above 0 temperatures around the clock, and rain on top of it, because you could have a very sudden melt. And the snow is really ready to melt now. It's ready to go. So it wouldn't take too much of that kind of weather to get things moving.
What might it look like if some of those conditions line up in a bad way? Have we seen this in recent years, or do we have to go back 40 years, as you're saying, snow-wise?
Yeah, probably you have to go back to the late 1970s when we had similar kinds of snowfalls. And we had some fairly serious floods in the 1970s. Everybody's familiar with 1974, which is a major flood affected Cambridge and so on. But that wasn't a spring melt flood. That was more of a summer, like it was May, but it was more of a summer rain flood. We had a big spring melt flood in 1975. And if you go to communities like New Hamburg and Ayr, that's the flood of record. That's the most serious flood that we've ever recorded, was 1975 along the Nith River. Now, fortunately, in much of the rest of the river system, we have reservoirs, and we can use these reservoirs to kind of moderate the flows to a certain point. So if we do get this big rush of water, we can kind of dampen the flood levels, but only to a point. There comes a point where if there's too much water coming downstream, there's not much we can do. When we run out of room in the reservoirs, we've run out of room.
It has to go somewhere.
It has to go somewhere, so we have to start sending it downstream. And that's when in those kind of conditions are when you would see some significant flooding.
On the grand scheme of things, how worried are people really in your office? How concerned?
Well, they're always concerned about flooding. That's why we're there. This year, though, they're taking extra steps to get ready for it. For example, we put out a news release that says we're hoping to get an icebreaker into the mouth of the Grand River around the breakup time, because that will help reduce flooding in that lower part of the river from Dunnville down to the lake. We're sort of having more intense conversations with the municipal flood coordinators, the emergency services, to make sure that they're ready if they need to close roads or open evacuation centers, go door to door to warn people. So making sure that they're geared up for it. We're keeping a close eye on the river itself. One thing we haven't talked about is the potential for ice jams. Ice jams can set up, and a lot of communities are prone to them. So you get a buildup of ice in a location, and the water can't get past the ice, so it backs up and it spills over into the community. West Montrose is prone to those, New Hamburg, Ayr, Paris, Brantford downstream. So one thing we're doing, and we're going to have this up on our website soon, is we've installed cameras at West Montrose, sort of webcams at West Montrose and Brantford, where we can actually keep an eye on the ice situation there. So if something does change dramatically, and ice jams happen very quickly, if it does happen, we can see it. In addition to all of the gauges we have, which record water levels. So there's just a heightened state of alert this year on our part and on the municipal and the emergency services.
Is there anything that can be done about ice jams? Can you break them up in some way, or is there techniques?
There are certain circumstances. Some communities have used dynamite to try and break these things up. The problem, though, is for example, if we wanted to go in and try and break up the ice jam at West Montrose, well, there's still no place for the ice to go. So you can go in and you can blow a hole in it, but it's just going to sit there anyway. So there's really not much you can do. At the mouth of the river, we bring in the icebreaker, but that's to get the ice out into the Lake Erie. We don't have a comparable situation in the middle of the river.
How rare is it that you bring in an icebreaker to the mouth of the river?
It's actually not that uncommon.
Okay.
I was looking through some records today. We had it in 2009 when there was some pretty serious flooding in that part of the river, but it was here in 2007 and probably a couple years before that. So it's not unusual. Usually they're just pretty quick visits. It comes in, it does its job,
Right.
it goes on the way.
Right.
In 2009 it was a little more dramatic because there was flooding going on when it came in, so there's a lot more awareness of it. But probably every 2, 3, 4 years it's in.
So when we're talking about worst case scenarios, how bad can it get with the conditions we're looking at? What's it look like?
Well, as I said, the last time we had this kind of snow cover was 1975. That was a pretty serious flood
Right.
in the parts of the watershed where we don't have reservoirs. So what we're telling people is we had a string of floods in 2008, 2009, and we're saying to people, if you were flooded out in 2008 or 2009,
Right.
that's the kind of thing you should be thinking about this year. So if your basement was underwater that year, your
Right.
street was flooded, recognize that that could happen again this year and do what you need to do around your house to get ready for it.
And we'll talk in the next segment about things people can do to get ready to be prepared, but where are the danger zones in our watershed?
Well, certainly along the Nith River where we have no control, along the Grand River, West Montrose, as I said, is an ice jam location. Now, following the 1974 floods, we, in conjunction with the municipalities in the province, built some good diking in Bridgeport section of Kitchener and in Galt. So they're actually quite a bit more protected than they used to be. But then even south of Galt, for example, Highway 24, in certain conditions, it can go underwater. Lots of rural roads will go underwater. So it's really important that people be aware of those kind of situations as well.
We'll have to take a break, but we'll be right back and talk more about flooding. And we're back, and you're watching Talk Local. Thank you for joining us again. We continue to talk about the risk of flooding this spring in the Grand River watershed, and we're pleased to be joined this time by Sergeant Donna Mancuso, who is the Emergency Planning Officer for the Waterloo Regional Police. And of course, Dave Schultz is back to talk some more about this problem. But Donna, first, if I could ask you, from a policing point of view, how concerned are you about what we could be heading towards?
Well, right now, we're trying to take more of a proactive approach. So we don't have those concerns should the flooding occur. Right now, we are in the process of working with GRCA. Dave and I have been working very closely all week in regards to getting the information out there, getting the brochures out there, linking them with our website as well, making sure that people are informed, I think is the biggest thing.
if I live in a flood-prone area, what are some basic things I can do? And I know that information is out there, but what are some of the key tips?
I think starting with making sure that, as Dave said earlier, if you know that you live in a floodplain, start making those preparations, such as removing things from your basement that you, articles that are of value to you. Making sure that you have an emergency kit in your home. Preparing for if you need to leave your home, having a safe place to go. Checking on your neighbors is a big issue as well, because there are some people in the community that may have mobility issues or that are elderly. So to be a good neighbor, check on your neighbors and make sure that they're okay and that they have a place to go as well. And our biggest concern, I think, is not just the property aspect of it, but the personal safety aspect of it. So staying away from not just open waterways, but waterways in general. I think that's the number one message to get out there, is just staying away from the waterways.
Can I ask you both this question? What is the biggest safety hazard when we have a fast-moving river and a lot of water moving through? Are there certain areas you should avoid, or just don't go near them at all?
The safest thing is just to stay away. And it doesn't even have to be a lot of water. If anybody saw any of the films from the Calgary flood over the summer, it can take just a few inches of water to move a car. So if people are tempted to try and drive through a moving river that's spilled out onto the street, don't do that. It's not a very good idea. So keep yourself, keep your children, keep your pets away from the river. Another thing that people should be aware of is that they should be knowledgeable about what happens to their services if there's a flood, their gas, their electricity, know how to turn the power off. It would be helpful if they knew how to turn their gas off, and what to do to restart it afterwards. That you should be, don't just go down and flick the switch. You should be talking to the utilities before you make those, before you turn things back on to make sure it's safe. And one thing we want to, one important message is, if there is a flood, it's really important that people be aware of what the emergency services are doing, the messages they're sending out. So if they say it's a good thing to evacuate a neighborhood, then you should evacuate the neighborhood, because it's not just a question of whether you can get in or out. It's also a question of, can the fire trucks get to your house if there's a fire? Can the ambulance get there if there's an accident? And they can't always do that if the house is surrounded by water. So if they order an evacuation, leave.
I'm going to ask you this too, Donna. If I'm seeing my house is in danger of flooding, where do I go to get information about whether I should leave or not? What happens there?
Just leave your house. That would be our best advice, is that if you see that your house is flooding, your street is flooding, just leave, because it's only going to get likely worse. So, you can log on to the GRCA website, you can log on to our website, but again, I would just take the proactive approach and just leave the house.
During the Dunnville flood in 2009, the emergency services there actually went door to door, making sure that people were safely out of their house, that the utilities were turned off, and the County of Haldimand set up an emergency evacuation center for them in the town's arena. And all the municipalities, they've developed these emergency response plans. So if New Hamburg or Ayr or some other community was affected by flood, the police and probably the fire department, public works department would make sure that people could get out and get to a safe place.
So flooding is not a new threat in our region. We've been dealing with it since we've had rivers. But are you ever surprised that you still have to go through this every year, that people still need to be educated and told about the hazards of flooding? Is it surprising that we have short memories?
Well, you can go a couple of years without a flood. And I'll tell a little story here. A couple of years ago, we had a series of floods, 2008, 2009, and New Hamburg had 3 pretty serious floods within a 10-month period. So we had a public information center, and we handed out some brochures. We had people from the utilities and so on. I spoke to a lot of people that night who said, I've been living in New Hamburg since 1980, and we've never seen flooding like this. What's changed? And I said, let me ask you a question. You bought your house in 1980. Do you know what happened the year before you bought your house? The house was on the market because there'd been a couple of floods. So you can get new people moving into a neighborhood that just aren't aware of the flood history of their house. And so you always have to be aware that you need to educate those people.
John, if I could ask you, if this gets bad, what do you need from the public? Maybe people who aren't affected by flood, what do you need from them?
From the public, I think we just need their assistance in any way that they can help. We need people to stay off the bridges and watch the flooding. That can sometimes be a real issue for us, because at the same time that we are trying to go door to door to warn people to say, okay, it's at a level 2, you need to leave your home, things like that. We are trying to do those things, but if we have to respond to other flood-related emergencies, such as people getting too close to the water, walking on the bridges when they're not supposed to because we're trying to shut the bridges down, things like that, it really hampers our ability to get out there and warn the people that actually live in the floodplain.
Is that flood tourism a problem? Do people still want to come out and watch these things, and you have
Yes.
to tell them to keep a distance?
Yes, it is a problem, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What haven't we covered? What else should people know when this, if it gets as bad as we think it could be,